Sometimes life takes everything from you, leaving you wondering how you'll make it through another day. Ray Ellis knows this feeling all too well. He's been raising his teenage daughter alone since cancer took his beloved wife. And now he's about to lose their home too. Desperate for money, he takes a job cutting fallen trees in Oregon's remote forests. When his saw cuts into an old pine, he finds something impossible. A giant hive filled with golden honey and a sound that changes everything. The tree hums with a deep, mysterious tone that brings back memories of his wife and makes him feel like she's trying to tell him something important. What ancient secret has been sleeping in this tree? And why does it feel like his wife is trying to tell him something? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning mist clung to the Douglas firs like old memories that wouldn't let go, and Ray Ellis understood that feeling better than most. He stood in his driveway at 5:30 in the morning, loading his battered Chevy pickup with the tools that had become both his salvation and his burden. Chainsaw, splitting maul, work gloves worn thin at the fingertips, and a thermos of coffee strong enough to wake the dead. The irony of that last thought wasn't lost on him. 3 years. That's how long it had been since Sarah's funeral, yet some mornings he still reached across the bed, expecting to find her there, still caught himself buying her favorite yogurt at the grocery store. Grief, he'd learned, wasn't a straight line. From pain to healing. It was more like Oregon weather, unpredictable with sudden storms that caught you unprepared. His daughter Emma appeared in the kitchen window, 17 years old, and carrying the weight of loss in her shoulders, the way teenagers shouldn't have to. She'd inherited her mother's dark hair and quick wit, but also her stubborn streak and her tendency to retreat inward when the world became too much. These days, Emma lived in a fortress of earbuds and silence, emerging only for necessary conversations. About school or money or the increasingly frequent discussions about their uncertain future. Ray knocked gently on the window and waved. Emma lifted her hand in acknowledgement, but didn't smile. He missed her smile. It had been rare since Sarah died, rarer still since the foreclosure notice arrived 6 weeks ago. The bank's patience had finally worn thin, and their small ranch house on Maple Street, with its creaky porch and the garden Sarah had loved, would be auctioned in 43 days, unless Ray could produce $12,000. $12,000. The number had become a drumbeat in his head, present in every quiet moment, lurking behind every decision. His regular handyman business barely covered groceries and utilities. The big contractors had most of the steady work locked up, leaving him to compete for odd jobs and emergency calls. Pride had kept him from asking for help from Sarah's family back in California. That, and the knowledge that her parents had never thought much of him to begin with. A small-town handyman hadn't been their dream son-in-law, even if he'd loved their daughter with every fiber of his being. The job that had brought him out before dawn was different from his usual work. Tom Brennan, who owned a lumber company, 40 miles east in the Cascade foothills, had called 3 days ago with an unusual proposition. A storm the previous month had brought down several massive trees on remote properties that Brennan was purchasing for timber rights. The owners wanted the fallen trees cleared before the land surveys began, but the locations were too isolated and the terrain too rough for Brennan's regular crews to handle efficiently. "It's hard work, Ray," Brennan had said, his voice crackling through the poor cell connection. "These aren't your typical suburban trees. We're talking about old-growth giants that have been lying in the forest for weeks. Some of them are 4-5 feet in diameter, but the pay is good. $200 per tree cleared, plus you keep any firewood you can haul out. Could be 20, maybe 30 trees if you're willing to put in the hours. $200 per tree." Ray had done the math immediately. 30 trees would be $6,000, not enough to save the house, but enough to buy time and maybe find another solution. He'd agreed without hesitation, despite Emma's worried expression, when he explained where he'd be working. "Dad, those old trees can be dangerous," she'd said, speaking more words to him in that moment than she had in weeks. "What if something happens and you're out there alone?" The concern in her voice had warmed him, even as it highlighted how fragile their little family had become. "I'll be careful, sweetheart. I've been doing this kind of work for 15 years, and I'll have my phone." She'd nodded but hadn't looked convinced. Cell service in the deep forest was spotty at best, and they both knew it. Now, driving through the pre-dawn darkness on winding forest service roads, Ray felt the familiar mixture of anticipation and anxiety that came with new work. His truck's headlights swept across towering trees that seemed to lean in from both sides, creating a tunnel of green and shadow. The radio played quietly, an old Johnny Cash song that Sarah had loved, and Ray found himself humming along despite his worries. The first property was marked by a rusted mailbox and a narrow dirt road that disappeared into thick timber. Ray turned off the main road and drove slowly, his truck bouncing over potholes and exposed rocks. According to Brennan's directions, the fallen trees were about half a mile in, near an old logging road that hadn't been used in decades. When Ray finally reached the site, he sat in his truck for a moment, taking in the scope of the job ahead. The storm had been merciless here. Massive trees lay scattered across several acres, like pickup sticks thrown by a giant child. Some had fallen cleanly, their roots pulled from the earth in tangles of dirt and stone. Others had shattered when they hit the ground, leaving debris, fields of bark and broken branches. But it was the largest tree that caught his attention, a Douglas fir that must have been growing when Lewis and Clark first mapped this territory. It lay across what had once been the logging road, its trunk so thick that Ray couldn't see over it even standing in his truck bed. The tree's canopy stretched into the forest, its branches creating a maze of green that would take hours to clear. Ray climbed down from the truck and walked the length of the massive trunk, trying to plan his approach. The tree was easily 5 feet in diameter at its base, tapering to perhaps 3 feet, where it had snapped off near the top. The bark was deeply furrowed, dark red-brown with patches of moss and lichen that spoke of centuries of growth. This tree had been a giant among giants, a cathedral pillar in the forest church. Standing there in the morning stillness, Ray felt a familiar pang of something that wasn't quite sadness, but wasn't happiness either. Sarah had loved trees like this. She'd grown up in the Sierra Nevada, where her father worked for the Forest Service, and she'd inherited his reverence for the ancient giants that predated human civilization by centuries. "They're like libraries," she used to say, running her hand along the bark of old trees during their weekend hikes. "Every ring tells a story about what the world was like that year. Droughts, fires, good growing seasons, human interference. If trees could talk, imagine the stories they'd tell." The memory of her voice was so clear that Ray looked around, half expecting to see her walking toward him through the ferns and fallen leaves. But the forest held only the sounds of morning, birds calling, wind moving through branches, the distant chatter of squirrels. Ray shook his head and returned to his truck for his equipment. This kind of thinking wouldn't pay the bills or save the house. The tree was beautiful, yes, and undoubtedly old beyond measure, but it was also blocking the road and needed to be cleared. Sentiment was a luxury he couldn't afford. He spent the first hour clearing smaller debris and branches, creating a safe workspace around the fallen giant. The physical work felt good, familiar. His muscles remembered the rhythm of this kind of labor: lift, carry, stack, repeat. Sweat began to bead on his forehead despite the cool morning air, and he found himself settling into the meditative state that came with honest work. By 8 o'clock, Ray had cleared enough space to begin the real work. He checked his chainsaw, a professional-grade steel that had been his most expensive tool purchase 5 years ago, and made sure he had plenty of fuel and chain oil. A tree this size would require multiple cuts, careful planning, and constant attention to safety. One mistake with a chainsaw, especially when working alone, could be fatal. The sun had finally crested the surrounding ridges, sending shafts of golden light through the canopy and illuminating the worksite like a natural cathedral. Ray positioned himself near the base of the trunk, planning his first cut. He would section the tree into manageable pieces, starting with the thickest part and working toward the crown. He pulled the starter cord and the chainsaw roared to life, its two-stroke engine echoing through the forest. The sound always made him think of his father, who had taught him to use a chainsaw when Ray was barely tall enough to handle one safely. "Respect the saw," his father had said, "and it'll serve you well. Get careless or cocky, and it'll remind you who's really in charge." Ray positioned the saw against the bark and began his first cut, the chain biting into wood that had been growing when his great-grandfather was born. The saw bucked slightly as it encountered different densities in the grain, but Ray adjusted his grip and kept the cut straight and true. What happened next would change everything. As the chainsaw cut deeper into the ancient trunk, Ray began to notice something unusual. The sawdust wasn't the typical light brown he expected from Douglas fir. Instead, it had a golden tinge, almost honey-colored, and it seemed to catch the morning light in an odd way. More strange still was the smell. Not the sharp, resinous scent of fresh-cut fir, but something sweeter, warmer, like wildflower meadows in summer. Ray paused his cutting and examined the sawdust more closely. He'd been working with wood for most of his adult life, and he'd never encountered anything quite like this. The golden particles seemed to shimmer slightly, as if they contained tiny flecks of metal or crystal. He rubbed some between his fingers and found it softer than normal sawdust, almost powdery. Curious now, Ray resumed cutting, paying closer attention to what he was seeing. As the chainsaw bit deeper into the trunk, the golden sawdust became more pronounced and the sweet smell grew stronger. There was something else too, a subtle vibration that seemed to run through the tree trunk, separate from the chainsaw's mechanical rumble. When Ray had cut about 18 inches into the 5-foot diameter trunk, his chainsaw suddenly lurched and nearly kicked back at him. He killed the engine immediately and stepped back, his heart racing. Chainsaw kickback was one of the most dangerous things that could happen, and experienced operators learned to recognize the signs and react quickly. But as Ray examined the saw and the cut, he realized the kickback hadn't been caused by a mechanical problem or hitting a knot in the wood. Instead, his chainsaw had encountered something hollow. The cut had opened into some kind of cavity within the trunk, which should have been impossible in a living tree this size. Ray set his chainsaw aside and knelt beside the cut, peering into the narrow opening he'd created. The cavity was dark, but he could see that it extended deep into the trunk. He pulled a small flashlight from his tool belt and aimed it into the opening. What he saw made him sit back on his heels in amazement. The interior of the tree trunk was honeycombed with a complex structure that looked almost crystalline in the flashlight beam. Golden formations hung from what appeared to be the interior walls, and everything seemed to gleam with a soft, warm light that couldn't entirely be explained by his flashlight. The cavity was far larger than the narrow cut suggested. It seemed to extend through much of the trunk's interior. Ray had heard of trees developing hollow sections as they aged, usually from disease or insect damage, but nothing like this. This looked almost deliberately crafted, like some kind of natural architecture. The golden formations were too regular, too purposeful to be random decay. And then Ray heard it, a sound so low and soft that he almost missed it beneath the normal forest noises. It was a humming, barely audible, that seemed to come from deep within the tree trunk. Not the mechanical hum of distant machinery, but something organic, musical even. The sound rose and fell in gentle waves, like a lullaby being hummed by someone just out of hearing. Ray pressed his ear closer to the cut, and the humming became more distinct. It was definitely coming from inside the tree, and it had an almost hypnotic quality that reminded him of something he couldn't quite place. The memory danced just at the edge of his consciousness. familiar but elusive. As he listened, the humming seemed to change slightly, taking on different tones and rhythms. Ray found himself relaxing despite the strangeness of the situation. There was something deeply peaceful about the sound, something that spoke to a part of him that had been tense and worried for so long that he'd forgotten what calm felt like. Ray's hands trembled as he widened the cut with his hatchet, carefully, chipping away bark and wood to create a larger opening into the mysterious cavity. The humming grew stronger with each piece he removed, and the golden light from within became more visible. What he had initially mistaken for crystalline formations was something far more extraordinary. They were honeycomb structures, but unlike any he had ever seen. The hexagonal chambers stretched deep into the hollowed trunk, each cell perfectly formed and glowing with a warm amber light. Some chambers were sealed with caps of what looked like pure gold, while others remained open, revealing thick, honey-colored liquid that seemed to pulse with its own inner radiance. The entire structure breathed with gentle movement, expanding and contracting in rhythm with the mysterious humming. Ray had kept bees briefly in his 20s before Emma was born and life became more complicated. He knew what normal honeycomb looked like, and this wasn't it. These structures were massive. Some individual cells were as large as his fist. The hexagonal precision was almost mathematical in its perfection, and the golden material seemed to be some kind of organic metal, neither pure wax nor pure honey, but something entirely unique. As Ray stared into the hollow trunk, movement caught his eye. Bees began to emerge from the deeper chambers, but these weren't ordinary honeybees. They were larger, their bodies a deep amber color that matched the honeycomb, and they moved with an almost ceremonial deliberateness. Their wings caught the morning light and threw off prismatic colors like tiny stained glass windows. The bees showed no aggression toward Ray. Instead, they seemed to regard him with what could only be described as curious intelligence. Several landed on his outstretched hand, their touch surprisingly warm, and Ray felt a gentle vibration through their tiny bodies that matched the humming from the hive. One bee, larger than the others and marked with intricate patterns that resembled script or symbols, crawled up Ray's arm to his shoulder. When it reached his ear, it began to hum, not the typical buzz of a bee's wings, but a melodic tone that seemed to carry meaning beyond sound. And that's when Ray heard it clearly for the first time. Sarah's voice, not speaking words, but humming the lullaby she used to sing to Emma when their daughter was small. The same gentle melody she would hum while cooking dinner or working in her garden. The tune that had been the background music of their family life for 15 years. Ray's knees gave out, and he sank to the forest floor, his back against the massive trunk. The bee remained on his shoulder, continuing its impossible song, while others gathered around him in a loose circle. Tears streamed down his face as memory after memory flooded back. Sarah humming while folding laundry, humming while they danced in the kitchen on quiet Sunday mornings, humming to herself during her final weeks when words became too difficult, but music remained. "This isn't possible," Ray whispered. But even as he spoke the words, he knew he was experiencing something beyond the boundaries of possible and impossible. The bees seemed to respond to his voice, their humming shifting to harmonize with his words, creating a sound that was both alien and deeply familiar. The large bee on his shoulder moved to his hand, and Ray felt compelled to reach toward the golden honeycomb. The moment his fingers touched one of the sealed chambers, warmth spread up his arm and throughout his body. The chamber opened at his touch, revealing honey that glowed like captured sunlight. Without fully understanding why, Ray brought his finger to his lips and tasted the honey. The effect was immediate and overwhelming. The world around him seemed to shimmer and shift, colors becoming more vivid, sounds more distinct. The humming of the bees expanded into a full symphony, with layers of melody and harmony that spoke directly to his soul. But more than that, Ray felt Sarah's presence as clearly as if she were standing beside him. Not a ghost or a memory, but something deeper, a connection that transcended death and distance. Through the honey and the humming and the impossible golden light, Ray felt his wife's love surrounding him, as real and warm as it had ever been in life. Ray. The voice came not from the air around him, but from within his own heart, as clear, as if Sarah was speaking directly into his mind. "You found us, Sarah." Ray's voice cracked as he spoke her name aloud for the first time in months. "How is this possible?" "Love doesn't end," came the response, carried on the wings of the amber. "Bees and woven into their impossible song. It just changes form. This place, this tree, these beautiful creatures, they've been waiting for you, waiting for someone who understands that some bonds can't be broken by death." Ray pressed both hands against the trunk, feeling the vibration of the massive hive within. "I don't understand. What is this place? What are these bees?" "They're guardians," Sarah's voice continued, growing stronger as more bees gathered around Ray. "This tree has stood for over 300 years, and 50 years ago, when these special bees were nearly extinct, it became their sanctuary. They're not just bees, Ray. They're keepers of memory, weavers of connections between the world of the living and the world of what comes after." The implications of what Sarah was telling him began to sink in. This wasn't just an unusual hive or some kind of hallucination brought on by stress and grief. This was something ancient and sacred, a bridge between life and death that had been hidden in the deep forest, waiting for the right person to discover it. "Why me?" Ray asked. "Why now?" "Because you need healing," Sarah replied, her voice carried by the collective hum of hundreds of bees. "And because Emma needs her father to find his way back to hope. The honey from this hive, Ray, it's not just food, it's medicine for souls, healing for hearts that have been broken by loss." As if summoned by Sarah's words, Ray's phone buzzed. In his pocket, he pulled it out with shaking hands, amazed that he had cell service this deep in the forest. A text message from Emma appeared on the screen. "Dad, I'm scared about the house. Are you okay out there? I love you." The message hit Ray like a physical blow. When had Emma last told him she loved him? When had she last reached out to him with anything other than necessity? The honey still warm on his tongue, Ray felt the full weight of how much his grief had cost both of them. In trying to protect Emma from his own pain, he had withdrawn from her just when she needed him most. "She's growing up without you," Sarah's voice continued gently. "Not because you're not there physically, but because your heart has been locked away with me. The house isn't what matters, Ray. Home is what you and Emma create together, wherever that might be." Ray looked at his phone screen, then at the glowing hive before him. The bees had begun to return to their chambers, but several remained on. His hands and arms, their presence warm and comforting. The large bee with the intricate markings remained on his shoulder, occasionally humming soft notes that seemed to echo with Sarah's voice. "What do I do?" Ray asked. "How do I help Emma? How do I save us?" "Trust the bees," Sarah replied. "Trust the honey. Trust the connections that love makes possible. This hive has been waiting for you, Ray. It's been preparing to help you heal. But you have to choose to accept that help. You have to choose to believe that love is stronger than loss." As Sarah's voice faded, the humming of the bees began to change. What had been a symphony of connection and memory shifted into something else. A song of possibility, of future hope, of healing that could happen if Ray was brave enough to accept it. Ray stood slowly, his legs still unsteady from the overwhelming experience. The opening he had cut into the trunk revealed just a small portion of the massive hive within. There had to be hundreds of pounds of the golden honey, perhaps thousands. And if what Sarah had told him was true, if this honey could heal hearts and souls, then he held something far more valuable than money, but he also held something dangerous. If word got out about this discovery, the tree would be destroyed, the bees scattered or killed, the sacred connection lost forever. Ray had to make a choice. Save his house with conventional work and lose this miracle, or find another way forward that protected what he had found. The bee on his shoulder hummed once more, and Ray swore he heard Sarah's voice one final time. Choose love, Ray. Choose healing. Choose hope. Ray drove home in a daze, the truck's cab filled with the lingering scent of wildflower honey and something else, something that reminded him of summer evenings and Sarah's perfume. In a small mason jar on the passenger seat sat 2 tablespoons of the golden honey, glowing faintly even in daylight. 3 of the amber bees had followed him to the truck, though they showed no interest in leaving the forest. They simply watched as he carefully sealed the precious honey, their intelligent eyes seeming to approve of his reverence for their gift. The drive back to town took 45 minutes, but Ray's mind was elsewhere, replaying every moment of his encounter with the impossible Hive, questioning his sanity and struggling to process what Sarah's voice had told him. By the time he pulled into his driveway, he had almost convinced himself it had all been a stress-induced hallucination. Grief could do strange things to a person's mind, and he'd been under tremendous pressure lately, but the jar of honey sitting beside him was undeniably real. Emma met him at the door, her face etched with worry. "Dad, you didn't answer my text for hours. I thought—" She stopped mid-sentence, studying his face. "You look different. Are you okay?" Ray set down his tool belt and looked at his daughter, really looked at her for the first time in months. When had she gotten so thin? When had those dark circles appeared under her eyes? Emma had been carrying her own burden of grief and fear, and he'd been too lost in his own pain to notice. "I'm okay, sweetheart," he said, and for the first time in 3 years the words felt true. "Actually, I think I might be better than okay. We need to talk." Emma's eyebrows rose. They hadn't had a real conversation in longer than either of them could remember. Their interactions had been reduced to logistics, school, meals, bills, with all the emotional content carefully avoided by mutual unspoken agreement. "About what?" Emma asked, following him into the kitchen. Ray pulled out a chair at their small dining table, the same one where Sarah used to help Emma with homework while dinner cooked in the oven. "About us. About your mom. About what we're going to do." Emma hesitated, then sat across from him. In the afternoon light streaming through the window, Ray could see so much of Sarah in their daughter's face. The same intelligent dark eyes, the same way of tilting her head when she was thinking carefully about something important. "I know I've been hard to live with," Ray began, his voice rough with emotion he'd suppressed for too long. "I know I've been so wrapped up in my own grief that I haven't been the father you need." "Dad," Emma started, but Ray held up a hand. "Let me finish, please. Your mother's death almost broke me, Em. I thought if I could just keep working, keep paying the bills, keep us functioning, that would be enough. But it wasn't enough, was it? You've been grieving too, and you've been doing it alone because I was too scared to face my own pain, let alone help you with yours." Tears began to gather in Emma's eyes, but she didn't look away. "I missed her too, Dad. I missed talking to her about school and boys and stupid stuff. I missed having someone who understood why I was sad or angry. I missed having a mom." "I know," Ray said, reaching across the table to take his daughter's hand. "And I missed having a wife. But we both still have each other, and I've been wasting that. I've been so afraid of losing you too that I forgot how to love you properly." Emma squeezed his hand, and Ray felt a connection with his daughter that he hadn't experienced since before Sarah's diagnosis. It was fragile, tentative, but real. "The house," Emma said quietly. "Are we going to lose it?" Ray thought about the golden honey sitting in his truck, about the impossible Hive, and Sarah's voice telling him that home wasn't a place, but what they created together. Maybe, probably, but you know what? That might not be the worst thing that could happen to us. Emma looked surprised. "What do you mean?" "I mean, maybe we've been holding on to the wrong things. This house is full of memories of your mom, and that's beautiful. But we can't live in a museum. We need to create new memories, new experiences." We need to build a life that honors what we had with her, but doesn't stop us from moving forward. But where would we go? Emma asked, and Ray heard the fear in her voice, the same fear that had been driving him for months. I don't know yet, Ray admitted, but I have an idea that might help both of us heal. Today, while I was working, I discovered something extraordinary, something that might change how we think about your mother, about death, about what's possible in this world. Ray retrieved the mason jar from his truck and set it carefully on the table. In the kitchen light, the honey's golden glow was unmistakable. Casting tiny rainbows on the walls and ceiling, Emma leaned forward, fascinated. "Dad, what is this? It's beautiful." "It's honey," Ray said simply. "But not ordinary honey. This came from a hive I found inside a fallen tree today. The bees that made it are unlike any species I've ever seen, and the honey, I think this honey might be magical." Emma looked skeptical but intrigued. Magical how? Ray struggled to find words that wouldn't sound completely insane. "When I tasted it, I felt your mother's presence. Not like remembering her, but like she was actually there with me. She spoke to me, Em. She told me things that helped me understand what we need to do to heal." "Dad," Emma said gently, "I know you miss Mom. We both do. But honey can't bring back the dead." "No," Ray agreed. "But maybe it can help the living find their way back to each other. Maybe it can help us remember that love doesn't end when someone dies. It just changes form." Emma studied the glowing honey, then looked at her father's face. Whatever had happened to him in the forest today, it had changed him. The defeated, distant man who had left that morning had been replaced by someone who seemed alive again, present again. "Will you try it?" Ray asked. "Just a tiny taste. If I'm losing my mind, at least we'll know together." Emma hesitated, then nodded. Ray carefully opened the jar, and immediately the kitchen filled with the scent of wildflowers and summer evenings. Emma dipped her pinky finger into the golden substance and brought it to her lips. The effect on Emma was different from what Ray had experienced, but no less profound. Instead of hearing Sarah's voice, Emma's eyes filled with tears of relief and recognition. "I can feel her," Emma whispered. "Dad, I can feel Mom's love. It's like she's hugging me from the inside." Ray came around the table and pulled his daughter into his arms, and for the first time in 3 years, they both cried together. Not tears of loss and despair, but tears of connection and healing. The honey had given them something precious, permission to grieve together, to love each other fully, and to believe that the bonds of family could survive anything. As they held each other, Ray made a silent promise. Whatever it took, he would protect the hive and the bees that had given them this gift. And somehow, he would find a way to build a new life with Emma that honored both Sarah's memory and their future together. The golden honey continued to glow softly on the table, a beacon of hope in their small kitchen, while father and daughter took the first steps toward healing that had been impossible just hours before. Over the next 3 days, the honey worked its quiet magic on the Ellis household. Ray found himself sleeping through the night for the first time in months, his dreams filled not with the nightmarish images of Sarah's final days in the hospital, but with warm memories of their life together. Emma began emerging from her fortress of silence, staying in the kitchen while Ray made breakfast, even sharing stories about school and her friends. The change was subtle, but undeniable. The house that had felt like a mausoleum for 3 years was slowly becoming a home again. Ray caught Emma humming while doing homework, the same melody Sarah used to sing, though Emma claimed she couldn't remember learning it. When Ray asked about it, she simply said, "It just feels right." But with healing came complications Ray hadn't anticipated. The first problem revealed itself when Ray returned to the fallen tree on Thursday morning. The site was exactly as he had left it, the cut into the trunk sealed with what looked like natural tree resin, though Ray was certain he hadn't seen the bees repair their hive entrance when he departed. The amber bees emerged as soon as he approached, greeting him with their melodic humming, and the large bee with the intricate markings immediately took its place on his shoulder. Ray had brought a larger jar this time, hoping to harvest enough honey to last Emma and him through their healing process, but when he gently opened the hive entrance and looked inside, he found something troubling. Several sections of the golden honeycomb appeared dimmer than before, and some chambers that had been full of glowing honey were now empty. "I'm taking too much," Ray realized aloud, and the bee on his shoulder hummed what sounded like agreement. "This hive is ancient, but it's not unlimited." The realization created a dilemma that kept Ray awake that night. The honey was clearly healing both him and Emma, but at what cost to the bees? And if he couldn't harvest significant quantities, how could he use this discovery to solve their financial problems without destroying the very thing that made it valuable? The second complication arrived Friday afternoon in the form of Tom Brennan's red pickup truck pulling into Ray's driveway. Ray watched through the kitchen window as Brennan climbed out, his expression concerned but not unfriendly. "Afternoon, Tom," Ray called, stepping onto the porch. "What brings you by?" Brennan was a good man, fair in his dealings and respected in the community. He'd known Sarah and had been one of the few people who continued checking on Ray and Emma. After the funeral casseroles stopped coming, "Ray, I wanted to follow up on the tree-clearing work," Brennan said, removing his baseball cap and running a hand through graying hair. "My land surveyor was out at that first property yesterday, and he mentioned something odd. Said you'd made a cut into that big Douglas fir, but hadn't finished the job. Everything okay out there?" Ray's stomach tightened. He'd been so focused on the honey and its effects on his family that he'd forgotten he was being paid to clear the fallen trees, not just harvest magical substances from them. "I ran into some complications with that particular tree," Ray said carefully. "The wood grain was unusual, and I wanted to approach it more carefully to avoid damaging my equipment." Brennan nodded, but his expression remained curious. "Fair enough. That old tree's probably got some interesting characteristics, but the property owner wants the road cleared by Monday for the survey team. Think you can finish up over the weekend?" "Absolutely," Ray lied, having no idea how he could complete the job without destroying the hive. "I'll have it cleared by Sunday night." After Brennan left, Ray sat on his porch steps, his head in his hands. He had less than 3 days to figure out how to save both his financial situation and the magical bees that had given him and Emma a chance at healing. The two goals seemed mutually exclusive. Emma found him there an hour later, returning from her part-time job at the local bookstore. She sat beside him on the steps, something she hadn't done in over a year. "You look worried, Dad. Is it about the house?" Ray almost laughed at the irony. 3 weeks ago, losing the house had seemed like the end of the world. Now, with the possibility of losing the hive and Emma's newfound peace, their mortgage problems seemed almost trivial. "It's complicated, Em. Remember I told you about finding that special honey in the tree? Well, the property owner wants the tree cleared for a land survey. If I cut it down, I'll destroy whatever is creating the honey. But if I don't, I'll lose the job, and we'll be back where we started financially." Emma was quiet for several minutes, and Ray could see her thinking through the problem with the same methodical approach she'd inherited from her mother. "What if we didn't need the money from clearing trees?" Emma finally asked. "What do you mean?" "What if we found another way to use the honey? You said it made both of us feel better, helped us connect with Mom's memory. What if it could help other people too?" Ray considered this. "I've thought about that, but there's not much honey available. I can't harvest large quantities without harming the bees." "Maybe we don't need large quantities," Emma said. "Maybe we need the right people. Dad, Mrs. Henderson from the bookstore has been struggling since her husband died last winter. She comes in every few days, and she always looks so lost and sad. What if the honey could help her the way it helped us?" The idea was both appealing and terrifying. Ray had no scientific understanding of what the honey actually did or how it worked. What if it only helped people who had lost spouses? What if It had side effects they hadn't discovered yet. What if sharing it somehow diminished its power? But as he looked at his daughter, really looked at the hope and purpose in her eyes, Ray realized that Emma had identified something important. The honey's value wasn't just in its ability to heal Ray and Emma. It was in its potential to help others find their way through grief and back to connection. How would we even begin something like that? Ray asked. Emma smiled, and Ray saw Sarah's intelligence and determination in that expression. Carefully, maybe we start with just Mrs. Henderson. We see if it helps her. If it does, maybe we help one or two other people. We don't charge money, we just share what we've been given. That evening, Ray sat at the kitchen table with a legal pad, trying to work out a plan. Emma had gone to her room to research grief counseling and bereavement support, approaching their situation with the thoroughness she usually reserved for school projects. The plan that emerged was both simple and terrifying. Ray would complete just enough tree clearing to satisfy Brennan and the property owner, but he would work around the hive, claiming the wood grain made the tree unsuitable for firewood. Meanwhile, he and Emma would begin quietly sharing tiny amounts of honey with carefully selected people in their community who were struggling with loss. It wasn't a get-rich-quick scheme, and it wouldn't solve their mortgage problems immediately. But for the first time since Sarah's death, Ray and Emma were working together towards something meaningful, something that honored the gift they'd been given while helping others find their way back to hope. As Ray closed the legal pad and headed to bed, he felt the weight of responsibility settling on his shoulders. The honey was more than just a magical substance. It was a trust, a calling, and perhaps the foundation for rebuilding not just his relationship with Emma, but their entire life together. Saturday morning brought the first test of their plan. Ray had spent most of Friday carefully cutting around the hive, removing enough of the massive trunk to satisfy Brennan while leaving the core intact. The amber bees seemed to understand what he was doing, staying calm throughout the process and even appearing to help by sealing exposed sections of their home with golden resin. Now, standing in Peterson's books with Emma and a tiny vial of honey hidden in his jacket pocket, Ray felt his courage wavering. Margaret Henderson sat in the reading corner, as she did every Saturday, a cup of tea growing cold beside her while she stared at a book without turning the pages. She'd been coming to the bookstore for months, Emma had explained, always ordering. The same Earl Grey tea, always sitting in the same chair, always looking like she was waiting for someone who would never come. Mrs. Henderson. Emma approached with the gentle confidence that had surprised Ray over the past few days. "How are you today?" Margaret looked up, her eyes focusing with effort on Emma's face. She was probably in her mid-60s, with silver hair that had once been carefully styled but now seemed like an afterthought. Her husband, Frank, had been the town's beloved high school math teacher for 30 years before his heart attack. "Oh, hello, Emma dear. I'm fine, thank you." The automatic response carried no conviction. Emma glanced at Ray, who nodded encouragement. They had practiced this conversation, but now that the moment had arrived, everything felt impossibly delicate. "Mrs. Henderson, my father and I have been going through some difficult times since my mum died," Emma said, settling into the chair across from Margaret. "We discovered something recently that has been helping us, and we wondered if you might be interested in learning about it." Margaret's expression sharpened slightly. "What kind of something?" Ray stepped forward, removing the small vial from his pocket. In the bookstore's warm lighting, the honey glowed like captured sunshine. "This is going to sound unusual, Mrs. Henderson, but we found this honey that seems to help people who are grieving. It helped Emma and me reconnect with each other and find some peace with our loss." Margaret examined the vial with curious skepticism. "Honey, I don't understand." "Neither do we, completely," Ray admitted. "All I can tell you is that when Emma and I tasted this honey, we both felt something we hadn't felt since Sarah died. A sense of connection, of peace, a feeling that love doesn't end when someone dies." "That's impossible," Margaret said, but her voice carried longing rather than dismissal. Emma leaned forward. Mrs. Henderson, what if it's not impossible? What if there are things in this world that we don't understand, but that can still help us? Would you be willing to try just a tiny taste? If nothing happens, you've lost nothing. But if something does happen, if it helps even a little, wouldn't that be worth it? Margaret's hands trembled slightly as she reached for the vial. Frank always said I was too practical for my own good. He believed in things I couldn't see. Said that's what made life magical. She paused, tears gathering in her eyes. I'd give anything to feel that magic again. Ray unscrewed the tiny cap and offered Margaret the vial. Just a drop on your finger. That's all it takes. Margaret dipped her pinky into the golden substance and brought it to her lips. The honey disappeared on her tongue, and for a moment nothing happened. Then Margaret's entire body seemed to relax, her shoulders dropping, her breathing deepening. "Oh," she whispered, her eyes widening. "Oh my, what do you feel?" Emma asked gently. Margaret's tears began to flow, but they were different from the tears of despair Ray had witnessed her shedding in the weeks since Frank's death. These were tears of recognition, of relief. "He's here," Margaret said, her voice filled with wonder. "Not here physically, but I can feel his love. It's like he's telling me that he's okay, that I'm going to be okay too. How is this possible?" Ray and Emma exchanged glances. The honey had worked again, but each person's experience seemed unique. Where Ray had heard Sarah's voice and Emma had felt her presence, Margaret was experiencing Frank's love as a tangible comfort. "We don't know how it's possible," Ray said. "We only know that it is." Margaret spent the next hour talking, really talking, for the first time since Frank's funeral. She told Ray and Emma stories about her marriage, shared memories she'd been afraid to revisit because they hurt too much, and began to make plans for small changes in her daily routine. The honey hadn't erased her grief, but it had given her permission to carry it differently. When they left the bookstore, Emma was quiet until they reached the truck. "Dad, did you see what happened?" It wasn't just that she felt better. She started living again. She made plans to visit her sister next week, something she'd been putting off. The honey didn't just help her feel Frank's presence. It helped her remember who she was before grief took over. Ray nodded, understanding what Emma was recognizing. The honey didn't simply provide comfort. It offered transformation, a way for people to integrate their loss into a fuller version of themselves rather than being consumed by it. Their second visit that afternoon was less successful. James Wilson, a neighbor who had lost his adult son in a car accident, was polite but skeptical. When he tasted the honey, he experienced nothing more than sweetness, and Ray and Emma left feeling confused and somewhat deflated. "Maybe it doesn't work for everyone," Emma suggested as they drove home. "Or maybe it only works for certain kinds of loss," Ray replied. "We need to understand this better before we try to help more people." That evening brought an unexpected visitor. Margaret Henderson knocked on their door just as Ray was finishing dinner dishes. She carried a small basket covered with a checkered cloth. "I hope you don't mind me stopping by," she said, her face brighter than Ray had seen it in months. "I wanted to bring you some cookies, Frank's favorite recipe. I haven't baked them since he died because they reminded me too much of what I'd lost. But today, after what happened with the honey, I realized they could remind me of what I still have, the memories, the love, the good times we shared." As Margaret handed over the basket, she took Ray's hands in hers. "Whatever that honey is, wherever it came from, it gave me something I thought was gone forever. It gave me hope. If there's anything I can do to help you share this gift with others, you just let me know." After Margaret left, Ray and Emma sat on the porch, sharing the cookies and watching the sunset. The simple pleasure of the moment, father and daughter together, no longer separated by walls of unspoken grief, felt like its own kind of magic. "We're doing something important, aren't we, Dad?" Emma asked. Ray thought about the bees in their ancient hive, about Sarah's voice telling him to trust in love's persistence, about Margaret's transformation and the light that had returned to her eyes. "Yes, sweetheart, I think we are. Word traveled quietly through their small Oregon town the way meaningful things do. Not through gossip or fanfare, but through subtle changes in people that others noticed and quietly inquired about. Margaret Henderson's transformation was impossible to miss. The woman who had shuffled through the grocery store like a ghost for 8 months was now walking upright, making eye contact, even humming softly while she shopped. When her sister, Patricia, visited from Portland and saw the change, she cornered Emma at the bookstore with barely contained desperation. Patricia's own husband had died 2 years earlier, and she'd been watching Margaret's decline with the helpless recognition of someone traveling the same dark road. "Whatever helped my sister," Patricia said, her voice low and urgent. "I need to know about it, please." This led to Ray and Emma's third attempt at sharing the honey, and their most successful yet. Patricia not only experienced a profound sense of her husband's continued presence, but she brought a perspective that helped Ray understand something crucial about what they were doing. "You know what this reminds me of?" Patricia said, sitting in Ray's living room an hour after tasting the honey, her face glowing with the same peace they'd seen in Margaret. "When I was a child, my grandmother used to talk about the old ways. She said there were places in the world where the boundary between life and death was thinner, where people who really needed it could still feel the love of those who had passed on." Ray leaned forward. "What kind of places?" "Sacred groves, ancient trees, places where indigenous peoples held ceremonies for the dead. My grandmother was part Cherokee, and she always said the trees were the keepers of memory, the bridge builders between worlds." Patricia paused, studying Ray's face. "Where exactly did you find this honey?" Ray hesitated, but something in Patricia's tone suggested she would understand rather than exploit. "In a tree in the national forest, a very old tree that had fallen. In a storm, the bees living inside it were unlike anything I'd ever seen." Patricia nodded, as if this made perfect sense. "My grandmother would have said you were meant to find it, that the tree chose you because you were someone who could be trusted with such a gift." Over the following weeks, Ray and Emma helped 4 more people, each referred by someone they'd already helped, each carefully chosen for their genuine need rather than casual curiosity. They developed a protocol. Ray would visit the person, first share his own story, and gauge their openness to something beyond conventional understanding. If the person seemed ready, Emma would join them for the actual sharing of the honey. They learned that the honey didn't work for everyone. It seemed to help those who had lost someone with whom they'd shared deep love, but had no effect on those dealing with other forms of loss or grief. They also discovered that each person's experience was unique. Some heard voices, others felt presence, still others experienced dreams or visions that brought comfort and understanding. But every successful experience followed the same pattern. The person emerged from their initial encounter with the honey fundamentally changed, not because their grief disappeared, but because they found a way to carry it that honored both their loss and their continued life. The healing work was rewarding, but it was also exhausting. Ray found himself spending more time counseling people than working his regular handyman jobs, which meant their financial situation continued to deteriorate. The foreclosure notice remained pinned to their refrigerator, a daily reminder that they had just over 2 weeks before losing their home. Emma, meanwhile, was struggling with her own challenges. Word had gotten around her high school about the weird honey thing her family was involved with, leading to whispered conversations and sideways glances. Some of her classmates thought it was cool, others thought it was creepy, and still others simply didn't know what to make of it. "Do you think we should stop?" Emma asked one evening after a particularly difficult day at school. "Maybe we're getting in over our heads." Ray considered the question seriously. They were indeed in over their heads, dealing with forces they didn't understand, taking on responsibilities they weren't trained for, risking their already fragile reputation in the community. "What does your heart tell you?" Ray asked, using one of Sarah's favorite phrases when Emma faced difficult decisions. Emma was quiet for several minutes. My heart tells me that Mom would want us to keep helping people, but my head tells me we need to be smarter about how we do it." Their conversation was interrupted by a knock on the door. Ray opened it to find a stranger, a woman in her 40s, with graying hair and tired eyes, holding the hand of a boy who couldn't have been more than 8 years old. "Are you Ray Ellis?" the woman asked. "My name is Carol Martinez, and this is my grandson Diego. Patricia Henderson told me you might be able to help us." Ray invited them in, learning that Carol was raising Diego after his parents had been killed in a car accident 6 months earlier. The boy hadn't spoken since the funeral, and Carol was desperate to find some way to help him process his grief. "I don't know if it works on children," Ray said honestly. "We've only shared it with adults so far." "Please," Carol said, her voice breaking. "He's disappearing into himself. The doctors say there's nothing physically wrong, but he won't eat, won't play, won't even cry. I'm losing him." Ray and Emma looked at Diego, who sat perfectly still on their couch, staring at nothing. His silence was different from the comfortable quiet of someone who simply didn't feel like talking. This was the silence of someone who had retreated so far into themselves that the outside world had become irrelevant. "We'll try," Ray said finally, "but you need to understand that we don't fully understand what we're dealing with. This isn't medicine or therapy, it's something else entirely." When Ray offered Diego the tiny vial of honey, the boy showed no reaction. But when Emma knelt beside the couch and spoke to him gently, Diego's eyes focused on her face with the first sign of awareness they'd seen. "Diego, I lost my mom too," Emma said softly. "I know how much it hurts. I know how scary it is to feel all alone. But sometimes, if we're very quiet and very still, we can still feel the love of the people who had to go away. Would you like to try?" Diego nodded once, barely perceptible, and Emma helped him dip his finger into the golden honey. What happened next was the most profound experience Ray and Emma had witnessed yet. Diego's entire body began to relax, and then, for the first time in 6 months, he began to cry, deep, wrenching sobs that seemed to come from the very center of his being. But these weren't tears of despair. Even as he cried, Diego reached out for his grandmother's hand, and when Carol pulled him into her arms, he whispered his first words since the accident. "Mama says she's not gone. Mama says she's in my heart." As Ray watched Diego crying in his grandmother's arms, finally able to express his grief instead of being trapped by it, he realized that what they were doing was more than just sharing magical honey. They were creating a community of healing, a network of people who understood that love doesn't end with death, and that sometimes the most profound healing comes from accepting rather than fighting the mysteries of life. Ray was returning from his weekly visit to the Hive on a foggy Thursday morning when he noticed the black sedan parked across from his house. The car was too clean, too expensive for their neighborhood, and the two men sitting inside wore suits that suggested government work rather than local business. Emma met him at the door, her face pale with worry. "Dad, those men have been watching the house for over an hour. Mrs. Chen from next door said they asked her questions about us, about what we've been doing, who's been visiting." Ray's stomach dropped. In their focus on helping people, he and Emma had been naive about the attention their activities might attract. Word had spread beyond their immediate circle, and apparently someone with authority had taken notice. Before Ray could decide how to handle the situation, one of the men approached their front door. He was tall, perhaps 50, with the kind of careful bearing that suggested military or law enforcement background. "Mr. Ellis, I'm Agent David Crawford with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. I'd like to speak with you about some unusual bee activity that's been reported in this area." Ray's mind raced. How had federal agents connected him to the Hive? Who had reported the bees, and what exactly did they know? "I'm not sure what you mean," Ray said carefully. "Sir, we've received reports of a previously unknown bee species in the Cascade National Forest, specifically in areas where you've been conducting tree removal work." We've also heard some interesting stories about honey with unusual properties. I'd appreciate a few minutes of your time to discuss what you might have observed." Emma stepped closer to Ray, and he could feel her tension. They had always known this moment might come, but they weren't prepared for it. "Of course," Ray said, inviting Crawford inside, "though I'm not sure how much help I can be." Crawford settled into their living room, declining offered coffee, but accepting a glass of water. His partner remained outside, though Ray noticed him speaking quietly into a radio. "Mr. Ellis, I'll be direct with you. The Fish and Wildlife Service has been tracking unusual ecological reports across the Pacific Northwest for several months. We've documented sightings of what appear to be amber-colored bees that don't match any known North American species. These sightings have been concentrated in old-growth forest areas, particularly around trees that are several hundred years old." Ray said nothing, waiting to see how much Crawford actually knew. "More interesting," Crawford continued, "are the reports we've received about honey with therapeutic properties. Honey that seems to help people dealing with grief and loss in ways that conventional medicine can't explain." Emma couldn't stay quiet any longer. "Is it illegal to find unusual honey? Are we in trouble?" Crawford smiled, and for the first time, he seemed more human than bureaucratic. "You're not in trouble, Miss Ellis, but you may be in danger, and you may be in possession of something far more significant than you realize." Ray leaned forward. "What do you mean in danger?" 3 weeks ago, a team of researchers from Meridian Biotech, a pharmaceutical company based in Seattle, obtained permits to conduct ecological surveys in the same forest areas where you've been working. Yesterday, we intercepted communications suggesting they've identified the location of what they're calling a unique biological resource and are planning to extract it for laboratory study. The implications hit Ray like a physical blow. They want to destroy the Hive. "More than that," Crawford said grimly. "Based on the communications we intercepted, Meridian Biotech believes they've found a new species of bee that produces honey with measurable psychoactive properties. They see dollar signs, a potential pharmaceutical goldmine that could be synthesized and marketed." Emma sat down heavily on the couch. "But that would ruin everything. The honey only works because the bees are in their natural habitat, in that specific tree. If they take them to a laboratory, the bees would likely die," Crawford finished, "and even if they survived, the honey produced in captivity would probably be ordinary honey. We've seen this before with other unique ecosystems. Remove the elements from their natural context, and the magic disappears." Ray studied Crawford's face, trying to understand his motivations. "Agent Crawford, why are you telling us this? Why aren't you working with the pharmaceutical company?" Crawford was quiet for a long moment, then reached into his jacket and pulled out a small photograph. It showed him in uniform, standing next to a woman with kind eyes and a warm smile. "This is my wife, Linda. She died of cancer 2 years ago. I've heard from reliable sources that your honey helped a woman named Margaret Henderson reconnect with her deceased husband's memory in ways that brought her peace. If there's even a chance that what you've found could help other people, the way it apparently helped Mrs. Henderson, then I have a personal interest in making sure it's protected rather than exploited." Ray and Emma exchanged glances. Crawford wasn't just a federal agent doing his job. He was a grieving widower who understood exactly what they were trying to accomplish. "What do you suggest we do?" Ray asked. "First, I need you to take me to the Hive. I need to document its location and the species of bees involved. If we can establish that this is a previously unknown subspecies living in a unique ecological niche, we can file for emergency protection under the Endangered Species Act." "And second?" Emma asked. "Second, you need to stop sharing the honey immediately. I know that sounds harsh, given the good you're doing, but every person you help creates another potential leak. Meridian Biotech has investigators asking questions throughout the community. It's only a matter of time before they trace the honey back to its source." Ray felt the weight of impossible choices settling on his shoulders. protect the Hive by abandoning the people who needed help, or continue their healing work and risk losing everything. There's something else, Crawford continued. The tree where you found the Hive, it's scheduled to be harvested next month as part of a selective logging operation. The Forest Service doesn't know about the bees, and the logging company has all the proper permits. Emma stood up abruptly. You mean, even if we protect it from the pharmaceutical company, they're going to cut it down anyway? That's right. Unless we can establish legal protection, that tree will be harvested along with several others in that section of forest. Ray put his head in his hands. 3 weeks ago, his biggest worry had been paying the mortgage. Now he was somehow responsible for protecting a magical hive, continuing to help grieving people heal, and preventing both a pharmaceutical company and a logging operation from destroying something irreplaceable. Agent Crawford, Ray said finally, if I take you to the Hive, what guarantee do I have that the government won't just take it over? That you won't decide it's too valuable or too dangerous for a small-town handyman to manage? Crawford met Ray's eyes steadily. You have my word that I will do everything in my power to protect both the bees and your family's connection to them, but I can't promise that higher authorities won't get involved once this becomes official. What I can promise is that if we don't act quickly, you'll lose everything anyway. Outside, Crawford's partner approached the house, his expression urgent. He whispered something to Crawford that made the agent's face darken. Mr. Ellis, we need to go now. My partner just received word that Meridian Biotech has accelerated their timeline. They're planning to move on the Hive location tomorrow morning. Ray looked at Emma, seeing his own fear and determination reflected in her face. Sarah's voice seemed to echo in his memory. Choose love, Ray. Choose healing. Choose hope. All right, Ray said, standing up and reaching for his keys. Let's go protect some bees. As they prepared to leave, Emma grabbed Ray's arm. Dad, what if this doesn't work? What if we lose everything we've built with the people we've helped? Ray pulled his daughter close, thinking about Diego's first words in 6 months, about Margaret Henderson's return to life, about all the people who had found connection and healing through the impossible gift of the amber bees. Then at least we'll have tried, sweetheart. Sometimes protecting what matters most means risking everything. The caravan of vehicles wound through the Forest Service roads in the pre-dawn darkness, Ray's pickup truck leading, followed by Agent Crawford's sedan and 2 additional Fish and Wildlife Service vehicles that had arrived within hours of Crawford's call for backup. The situation had escalated beyond anything Ray had imagined when he first cut into the ancient Douglas fir 3 weeks earlier. In the passenger seat of Ray's truck, Emma clutched a thermos of coffee and tried to process how quickly they're quiet. Healing work had transformed into what Crawford described as a race against corporate exploitation. Behind them, the government vehicles carried equipment for documenting the Hive, temporary barriers to secure the site, and legal paperwork that could potentially protect the bees under emergency conservation measures. Dad, what if the bees don't trust all these strangers? Emma asked, as they turned onto the narrow logging road that led to the Hive site. What if they disappear or stop producing the honey because we brought the government to them? Ray had been wondering the same thing. The amber bees had shown remarkable intelligence in their interactions with him, seeming to understand his intentions and respond to his emotional state. But they had always been alone together, just Ray and the ancient Hive in the quiet forest. The presence of multiple vehicles, official documentation, and federal agents might disrupt the delicate relationship that made everything possible. I don't know, sweetheart, Ray admitted, but if we don't try to protect them legally, they'll definitely be destroyed. At least this way we have a chance. As they approached the site, Ray's headlights illuminated something that made his blood run cold. 3 vehicles were already parked near the fallen tree, 2 white vans with Meridian Biotech logos, and a larger truck equipped with what appeared to be specialized extraction equipment. Crawford's voice crackled over the radio. Ray had been given. Ellis, stop your vehicle, but don't get out. We've got a situation here. Ray pulled over, and within seconds Crawford appeared at his driver's window, his expression grim. "They beat us here. My partner counted at least 6 people, and they've already begun some kind of preliminary work around the tree." Through the forest, Ray could see lights moving near the Hive site and hear the distant sound of equipment running. The corporate team had arrived under cover of darkness, apparently planning to extract whatever they could before dawn brought the possibility of interference. "What can we do?" Emma asked, leaning across Ray to speak to Crawford. "Legally, not much until we get our emergency protection order processed, which won't happen until the courts open this morning. Practically," Crawford paused, seeming to weigh his words. "Mr. Ellis, you discovered this hive, and you've been working this site under contract. You have more legal standing to be here right now than they do." Ray understood what Crawford was suggesting. "You want me to confront them. I want you to exercise your legitimate right to be on this site and see what they're doing. My team and I will be right behind you, ready to document any violations of environmental protection laws." Ray looked at Emma, who nodded with determination that reminded him painfully of Sarah facing her cancer diagnosis. "We're not letting them destroy the bees without a fight." They approached the Hive site on foot. Crawford and his team spread out behind them with cameras and documentation equipment. What Ray saw when they came within view of the fallen tree made him sick to his stomach. The Meridian Biotech team had set up a mobile laboratory around the Hive entrance, complete with specimen containers, extraction pumps, and what appeared to be a refrigerated storage unit. 2 technicians in protective suits were using some kind of suction device to capture bees as they emerged from the tree, while another team member collected samples of the golden honeycomb visible through the opening Ray had originally cut. But worse than the extraction equipment was what Ray could hear, or rather, what he couldn't hear. The melodic humming that had characterized the Hive from his first discovery was gone, replaced by an agitated buzzing that spoke of fear and distress. The bees' behavior had changed completely, their movements erratic and defensive rather than the purposeful, almost ceremonial flight patterns Ray had observed before. "Stop!" Ray called out, stepping into the circle of portable floodlights the corporate team had set up. "You're on private property, and you're disturbing a protected ecosystem." A woman in a business suit turned from her position, supervising the extraction. She was perhaps 40, with steel-grey hair and the kind of confident bearing that came from years of corporate authority. "Mr. Ellis, I presume? I'm Dr. Rebecca Hartman, Chief Research Officer for Meridian Biotech. I'm afraid you're mistaken about both the property status and the protection level of this site. We have full permits for ecological research in this area." Crawford stepped forward, showing his badge. "Agent David Crawford, U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. Dr. Hartman, I need to see those permits, and I need you to suspend all collection activities until we can verify your authorization to remove biological specimens from federal forest land." Dr. Hartman's expression hardened. "Agent Crawford, our permits are completely in order. We're conducting legitimate research into an unidentified insect species that may have significant pharmaceutical applications. Unless you have a court order, we're within our rights to continue our work." While the adults argued legal technicalities, Emma had moved closer to the tree where the extraction was taking place. Ray watched in alarm as she approached the Hive entrance, seemingly oblivious to the chaos around her. "Emma, stay back!" Ray called, but his daughter was already kneeling beside the opening in the trunk. What happened next defied everything Ray had learned about bee behavior. As Emma approached, the agitated buzzing from within the hive began to calm. The amber bees that had been flying in panicked circles started to settle, and several landed gently on Emma's outstretched hands. "They remember me," Emma said wonderingly. "They know I'm trying to help them." Dr. Hartman had stopped arguing with Crawford and was staring at Emma with undisguised fascination. "Remarkable. The insects are showing clear recognition behavior. How long has your daughter been interacting with this colony?" "Long enough to know that what you're doing is wrong." Emma said, standing to face the researcher. These bees aren't just another species to be catalogued and exploited. They're guardians of something sacred, something that helps people heal from loss and grief. Miss Ellis, I understand you may have formed an emotional attachment to these insects, but you're anthropomorphizing behavior that has perfectly rational biological explanations. The psychoactive properties of their honey can be reproduced synthetically once we understand the chemical compounds involved. Emma's eyes flashed with anger that Ray recognized as pure Sarah, fierce protectiveness combined with moral clarity. You don't understand anything. The honey only works because of where it comes from, because of the connection between the bees and this ancient tree, because of the love and intention behind it. Take that away, and you'll have nothing but expensive sugar water. As if responding to Emma's words, the large bee with intricate markings, the one Ray thought of as the Hive's spokesperson, emerged from the tree and flew directly to Emma's shoulder. The moment it landed, the bee began its melodic humming, and the sound seemed to carry across the clearing with unusual clarity. Dr. Hartman pulled out her phone and began recording. Fascinating. The acoustic patterns are definitely more complex than typical bee communication. This could indicate a previously unknown level of insect intelligence. But Ray heard something. In the bee's song that the researcher missed, a note of desperate sadness, a plea for understanding and protection. The bee was trying to communicate with the humans gathered around its home, trying to make them understand what was at stake. Dr. Hartman, Ray said, his voice carrying new authority, I'm formally requesting that you stop your extraction activities. As the person who discovered this hive, and as someone who has been interacting with these bees for weeks, I'm telling you that what you're doing is harming them. Mr. Ellis, with all due respect, your emotional investment in these insects doesn't give you scientific authority. She was interrupted by a sound that made everyone in the clearing stop talking. It was humming, but not from a single bee. Every bee in the vicinity, hundreds of them, had begun to sing together, creating a harmony so complex and beautiful that even Dr. Hartman's team stopped their work to listen. Crawford lowered his radio, his face filled with wonder. I've never heard anything like that. The communal song of the amber bees seemed to fill the entire forest, echoing off the surrounding trees and creating layers of melody that spoke directly to the human heart. Ray felt the same peace he'd experienced during his first encounter with the honey, but magnified by the presence of the entire colony singing together. Emma walked closer to the tree, and the bees' song grew even more beautiful, more complex. It was clear they recognized her as an ally, someone who understood their true nature and purpose. They're saying goodbye, Emma said softly, tears streaming down her face. They're thanking us for trying to protect them, but they're saying goodbye. Dr. Hartman stepped forward, her scientific detachment finally cracking. What do you mean, goodbye? Ray understood with horrible clarity. The bees knew they were about to lose their ancient home, either to corporate extraction or legal battles that would drag on for months while their tree was cut down by the logging company. They were using their final moments of freedom to create something beautiful, something that would remind the humans who had gathered around them that some things in the world were more valuable than scientific discovery or pharmaceutical profits. They're dying, Ray said, his voice breaking. We're too late. We're all too late. The forest had gone completely silent except for the bees' farewell song, which continued to weave through the air with heartbreaking beauty. Even Dr. Hartman's extraction team had stopped their work, standing transfixed by the impossible harmony filling the clearing. Ray felt Sarah's presence more strongly than he had since that first day at the Hive. Not just her memory or the echo of her voice, but her actual presence, as if she were standing beside him in the circle of floodlights, her hand warm in his. Ray, her voice whispered in his mind, carried on the wings of the singing bees. This isn't the end. This is the choice. Emma turned from the tree, her face illuminated by something beyond the artificial lights surrounding them. Dad, they're not dying. They're waiting. Waiting for what? Crawford asked, his voice hushed with reverence. Emma approached Ray, and he saw in her eyes the same wisdom that had always shone in Sarah's when she faced impossible situations. They're waiting for someone to make the sacrifice. They're waiting for someone to choose what matters most. Ray understood. The bees, in their ancient wisdom, were offering a choice that went beyond legal protection or corporate extraction. They were offering the chance to preserve their gift, but at a cost that would require everything he and Emma had built together. Dr. Hartman, perhaps sensing that something significant was happening beyond her scientific understanding, stepped closer. What sacrifice? What choice? The large bee on Emma's shoulder flew to Ray, landing on his outstretched hand. As it settled, Ray felt the familiar vibration that accompanied the bee's attempts at communication, but this time the message was crystal clear. The hive could be saved, but not in its current form. The ancient tree was indeed dying, not from the corporate intrusion, but from natural causes that had been accelerated by the storm that felled it weeks ago. The bees had known this from the beginning. They had been preparing for a transition, waiting for the right humans to help them make the journey to a new home. But the new home couldn't be a laboratory or a commercial bee farm. It had to be a place where the sacred connection between the bees and the humans who understood their true purpose could continue. It had to be a place where the honey could continue to heal hearts and bind the living to the love of those who had passed beyond. Emma, Ray said, his voice barely above a whisper, they want to come home with us. Emma nodded, understanding flooding her face. But not to our house, to a new home, a place we create together, where we can protect them and continue the healing. Work properly. Crawford stepped forward, his expression shifting from official concern to personal investment. What are you talking about? Ray looked around the clearing, at the corporate extraction equipment, at the federal agents with their documentation cameras, at the fallen tree that had sheltered the bees for decades. None of this could preserve what really mattered. We're talking about starting over, Ray said. Emma and I have been trying to save our old house, our old life, because we were afraid of letting go. But maybe we've been fighting the wrong battle. Emma took Ray's free hand, and he felt the bee's vibration increase as the three of them connected, human family and ancient guardian, forming a bridge across the species divide. The foreclosure, Emma said, her voice growing stronger with certainty. We let it happen. We use the time we have left to find a new place, somewhere remote enough to protect the hive, somewhere we can build the life Mom always wanted us to. Have? Dr. Hartman had been listening with growing understanding. You're proposing to relocate the entire colony. That's extremely dangerous. Most bees don't survive that kind of disruption. These aren't most bees, Ray replied, feeling Sarah's presence growing stronger around him. And this isn't just about relocation, it's about transformation. The bee in Ray's hand began to glow with the same golden light that had emanated from the honey, and the glow spread to encompass both Ray and Emma. The singing of the colony reached a crescendo that seemed to lift them all beyond the mundane world of permits and property rights and corporate interests. In that moment of transcendent connection, Ray saw exactly what needed to happen. He and Emma would let their old life go, the house that had become a museum of grief, the small-town routine that had kept them trapped in the past. They would take the bees and find new land, remote and protected, where the healing work could continue properly. But more than that, they would become guardians themselves, keepers of an ancient wisdom that connected the world of the living with the realm of eternal love. They would build a sanctuary, not just for the bees, but for people like themselves who needed to heal from loss, who needed to remember that love transcends death. Agent Crawford, Ray said, his voice filled with new purpose, I need to ask you a different kind of favor. Crawford's eyes never left Ray's face as the golden glow continued to emanate from the bee in Ray's hand. Around them, the Amber Colony's song had shifted into something that sounded almost ceremonial, as if they were witnessing an ancient ritual of transition and blessing. "What kind of favor?" Crawford asked, and Ray could hear in his voice the same mixture of official caution and personal hope that had characterized their entire relationship. "Help us disappear," Ray said simply. "Not illegally, not permanently, but officially enough that Dr. Hartman's company can't track us down. We need time and space to relocate the bees properly, and we need protection while we establish a new sanctuary." Dr. Hartman stepped forward, her corporate composure finally cracking completely. "Mr. Ellis, you don't understand the magnitude of what you're proposing. These insects represent a potential breakthrough in grief therapy, in understanding the connection between psychoactive compounds and human consciousness. You can't simply walk away with them." Emma turned to face the researcher, and Ray saw in his daughter's expression a maturity that reminded him how much she had grown through their shared journey of healing. "Dr. Hartman, with respect, you don't understand what these bees actually are," Emma said. "They're not a pharmaceutical resource waiting to be exploited. They're guardians of something sacred, something that can only exist in the right relationship between humans and the natural world." The bee on Ray's hand took flight, circling the clearing once before returning to the hive entrance. As if responding to a signal, the entire colony began to move with purpose, streaming out of the ancient tree in organized formations that had nothing to do with typical bee behavior. Crawford watched the organized exodus with amazement. "They're leaving on their own. They're abandoning the hive." "No," Ray said, understanding flooding through him as he watched the bees' coordinated movement. "They're preparing for the journey. They've been waiting for us to make the choice to protect them properly." The bees formed complex patterns in the air above the clearing, their bodies creating geometric shapes that pulsed with the same golden light Ray had seen in the honey. Dr. Hartman's extraction equipment had become irrelevant. The bees were dismantling their own hive from within, carefully removing the sacred honeycomb and organizing it for transport. "This is impossible," one of Dr. Hartman's technicians whispered. "Bees don't behave this way. They don't plan strategic relocations." Emma walked closer to the swirling patterns of amber-colored insects. "They do when they're not just bees. They do when they're something more." Crawford pulled out his radio. But instead of calling for backup or reporting the situation, he seemed to be struggling with a decision. Finally, he keyed the microphone. "Crawford to base. I'm declaring this site a potential endangered species habitat under emergency protection protocols. No extraction activities are authorized until full ecological assessment is complete." Dr. Hartman spun to face him. "Agent Crawford, you don't have the authority to make that determination in the field." "Actually, I do," Crawford replied, his voice carrying new conviction. "And what's more, I'm designating Mr. Ellis as a consulting expert on this species, which gives him protected status as a federal contractor." Ray understood what Crawford was offering. Official cover for whatever came next, legal protection during the transition period, and time to establish the bees in a new location before corporate or bureaucratic interests could interfere. Serve. Organized swirl of bees began to settle, not returning to the damaged tree, but gathering around Ray and Emma like a living cloud of golden light. The trust implicit in their behavior was overwhelming. Hundreds of creatures whose species had survived for centuries were placing their future in the hands of two humans they had known for only a few weeks. "Dad," Emma said softly, "they're ready to go home with us." Ray looked around the clearing one final time, at the corporate equipment that would extract and destroy, at the federal agents who meant well but couldn't understand the true nature of what they were protecting, at the ancient tree that had served as a sanctuary but could no longer sustain life. Then he looked at his daughter, whose face glowed with the same light that surrounded the bees, and felt Sarah's presence blessing their choice to choose love over safety, transformation over preservation of the status quo. "Agent Crawford," Ray said, "we're going to need that truck. What followed was the most extraordinary relocation in the history of human bee cooperation, with Crawford's team providing official oversight and Dr. Hartman's group ordered to stand down pending ecological review. Ray and Emma carefully transferred the sacred honeycomb into specially prepared containers. The bees supervised every step of the process, their continued song providing guidance and approval for the humans' careful handling of their most precious creations. As the sun crested the surrounding mountains, painting the clearing in natural, golden light that matched the supernatural glow of the amber colony, Ray felt the last vestiges of his old life falling away. The house they were about to lose, the small-town routine that had become a prison of grief, the fear of change that had kept them trapped in the past, all of it dissolved in the morning light. They were embarking on something entirely new, something that honored both Sarah's memory and the possibility of a future filled with healing and hope. 6 months later, Ray stood on the covered porch of the small cabin he and Emma had built on 20 acres of remote forest land in the Oregon Cascades, watching the amber bees tend to their new garden in the morning sunlight. The property, purchased with help from Crawford's connections and a network of people who understood the value of what Ray and Emma were protecting, was everything the old Hive site had been and more: ancient trees, pristine water sources, and isolation that protected the bees' sacred work from exploitation. The transition hadn't been easy. The foreclosure on their old house had proceeded as scheduled, and Ray had felt genuine grief watching strangers walk through the rooms where Sarah had lived and loved. But as Emma had reminded him while they packed their few meaningful possessions, home wasn't a building. It was the love they carried with them and the healing they could offer to others. The new Hive occupied a centuries-old cedar that had welcomed the amber bees as if it had been waiting for them. The tree stood at the center of what Emma had dubbed the sanctuary, a carefully tended space where the bees could continue their ancient work in safety and solitude. The honeycomb they produced here glowed with the same golden light as before, but somehow seemed even more potent, as if the bees were thriving in their new home. Emma appeared in the doorway, carrying 2 mugs of coffee and wearing the peaceful expression that had become her default over the past few months. She had finished her senior year through online courses, and in the fall she would begin studying environmental science at a small college that specialized in sustainable agriculture and human ecosystem relationships. But for now, she was content to be a guardian of mysteries alongside her father. "Mrs. Patterson will be here at 10, Emma said, settling into the chair beside Ray's. "And the Hendersons are driving up from town this afternoon for their monthly visit." Ray nodded, sipping his coffee and watching the bees' morning choreography. Mrs. Patterson was a recent widow from the nearest town, referred by Margaret Henderson, who had become something of an unofficial ambassador for their work. The monthly visits from people who had been helped by the honey had evolved into informal support group gatherings where those who had experienced the bees' healing could share their ongoing journeys through grief. The sanctuary operated quietly, by word of mouth and careful referral. Crawford made periodic official visits to document the bees' behavior for scientific purposes, but he had also become a friend and protector, ensuring that no unauthorized researchers or corporate interests could threaten their work. Dr. Hartman's company had filed legal challenges, but without access to the original Hive location and with Crawford's federal protection in place, they had eventually moved on to other projects. "Dad, do you ever miss it?" Emma asked, gesturing toward the distant valley where their old town lay. The regular life, the normal problems? Ray considered the question while watching one of the larger amber bees. He was certain it was the same individual who had first communicated with him, tending to flowers Emma had planted specifically for the colony's nutrition. "I miss your mom," Ray said honestly. "I always will, but I don't miss the grief that used to consume everything else. I don't miss feeling helpless or disconnected from you." Emma reached over and took his hand, a gesture that had become natural again over the months of their shared purpose. I feel her here, Dad, not just when we taste the honey, but all the time. Like she's part of what we're doing. Ray squeezed his daughter's hand, understanding exactly what she meant. Sarah's presence hadn't faded with time or distance. If anything, it had grown stronger as Ray and Emma had learned to carry her love forward in their work with others who needed healing. The sound of a car engine drew their attention to the dirt road that wound through the forest to their cabin. Mrs. Patterson's aging Honda appeared through the trees, and Ray felt the familiar mixture of anticipation and responsibility that came with each person who sought the bees' help. Some visitors experienced profound healing, like Margaret Henderson and little Diego Martinez. Others found subtler comfort, a gentle easing of the sharp edges of grief that allowed them to begin moving forward again. A few, like the first man Ray and Emma had tried to help, felt nothing at all, the honey remaining simply honey for those whose loss was different or whose hearts weren't ready for such healing. But every person who came to the sanctuary left with something valuable, even if it wasn't the magical connection they had hoped for. They left with the knowledge that they weren't alone in their grief, that healing was possible, and that love truly didn't end with death. As Mrs. Patterson's car pulled into the small clearing near the cabin, Ray stood and stretched, preparing to welcome another seeker to their unlikely sanctuary. The work wasn't easy. It required emotional presence, careful judgment, and the constant responsibility of protecting something irreplaceable. But it was work that honored Sarah's memory while building a future where Emma could thrive. The amber bee that Ray thought of as his first friend settled on his shoulder as he walked toward Mrs. Patterson's car, its familiar humming carrying what sounded like approval and encouragement. Behind him, Emma gathered the small vial of honey they would share with their visitor, her movements confident and purposeful. In the distance, the ancient cedar swayed gently in the morning breeze, its branches heavy with golden honeycomb that caught and reflected the sunlight like stained glass windows. The tree seemed to hum with contentment, as if it understood that it had become part of something larger than itself, a bridge between the world of the living and the realm of eternal love, tended by humans who had learned to trust in mysteries they couldn't fully understand, but could faithfully serve. Ray smiled as he approached their visitor, feeling Sarah's love surrounding him like warm sunlight, and knew that he and Emma had finally found their way home.